Our next speaker, Josh Garfinkel, Senior Campaigner, Earthroots. As you can see in the bio, Josh has been working for Earthroots for over 7 years, and his work over the past 7 years has entailed being part of coalitions that lobbied for a new Provincial Parks Act and Endangered Species Act, co-authoring various reports pertaining to groundwater use on the Oak Ridges Moraine and surrounding greenbelt, and hosting workshops for people afflicted by environmental issues in various parts of the moraine. Josh?
Thank you. There you go. I included STORM's logo, Save the Oak Ridges Moraine's logo, and I want to point out Jenny Gordon in the crowd, if you want to stand up a bit. Just because we've worked really well together over the past few years, and specifically on the commercial fill issue, it's been really a collaborative effort. So the things I'm talking about today definitely represent both organizations. So I sit on the board of directors for Save the Oak Ridges Moraine Coalition as well. Along with Ontario Nature and Eco-Justice, which is the Environmental Law Foundation, our organizations were instrumental in working together to lobby for the Oak Ridges Moraine legislation. STORM focuses specifically on preserving the hydrological and ecological integrity of the moraine. Earthroots, the group that I'm representing, our scope is a bit more of a broader provincial scope. But one thing that our two organizations have in common, for those of you who don't know about us, is that I guess you could say we're the pointy stick. We're the lobby groups. Some people may not like that, but I think we're pretty good at doing that. So that's our role here. A perfect example of our grassroots approach is how we actually learned about commercial fill. This may sound a bit naive, but up until I guess 2.5 years ago, I didn't really know that large-scale fill operations on the moraine were really an issue. In October in 2010, Earthroots and STORM and Council of Canadians, we staged a rally at Queen's Park. The main message was calling on the provincial government to introduce a provincial water strategy. The reason I'm telling you this is because I'm trying to explain the relationship we have with Carmela, and that was an amazing speech, by the way, amazing presentation. The day before the rally, I'd received a call from Carmela explaining the issue of dumping fill on Lake Ridge Road. I didn't quite get the extent of the issue until I started doing my research. I should also note that Ian McLaurin, her dedicated colleague from Lake Ridge Citizens for Clean Water, also approached me and Debbie and Mark from Council of Canadians at the rally at Queen's Park, and really got our attention by presenting a very, very strong case for what the issue was here. Long story short, within a month, we were getting calls from different councillors in different townships in the area and different citizens, and we started to realize how serious of an issue this was. And obviously, Carmela having her facts straight and being so diligent really helped. Now, as much as we value our role in the conservation movement as lobby groups, I already said that, something is not working when local governments and citizens have to turn to us small nonprofits for guidance and assistance. So that was our entry into the issue of commercial fill. I also just want to say it's really terrific that so many people are here from across Ontario. Many walks of life, and thanks to the Township of Scugog and Rob for contacting us, and everyone at the Kawartha Conservation for not only hosting the symposium, but including us as non-government organizations to present today. It's really good to be here. Now, last year with Ontario Nature and STORM, Earthroots launched a campaign called Moraine Can't Wait. Leading up to 2015 review of the Oak Ridges Moraine Plan, what we did was an analysis of what we saw were the major threats or assaults to the Oak Ridges Moraine. And when we say assaults, we say things that were threatening the integrity of the Oak Ridges Moraine. Now, large commercial fill operations were at the top of this list. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later, but I'm going to take it a step or two back for a moment and explain a little bit about the Oak Ridges Moraine. It's going to be as quick of a Moraine 101 as I can do. I think Steve Hollish, who's up next, will do a better job since he's a hydrogeologist, but this slide gives you a context of where we are in relation to the Great Lakes Basin. Now, on the west side, we are abutted by the Niagara Escarpment, and the protected countryside around us is the Greenbelt, where obviously a lot of food comes from in Ontario. Now, being 160 kilometers, it spans a really significant portion of central Ontario, and the red arrow is where we are today. Now, 10 million years ago, a glacier covered this whole area, and it retreated. As it retreated, it covered southern Ontario. Now, all the debris being pulled along melted into the crevice and formed layers of sand and gravel in a pile and left a moraine. Now, part of my job at Earthroots is doing environmental education. I've done presentations about the moraine from anywhere from grades 5 all the way to university. And one thing I always try to say, or the one thing that always resonates for some reason with people is when I just say the moraine is a pile of dirt. I know it's not the most exciting way to put it, but for some reason that captivates people. So basically the snow melts and rainfalls, percolates down through the layers and replenishes the aquifers below. It's not unlike a massive Brita filter. It was because of the need to replenish the water reserves that new developments that could hard surface or cap the surface are not permitted. Now, I always find this a really important visual. There's 65 rivers that flow from the moraine to 5 large bodies of water: Lake Ontario, Lake Simcoe, Georgian Bay, Lake Scugog, and of course Rice Lake. Now, let's obviously bring it back to the issue of fill, since I only have limited time today. With legislation to protect the moraine, which is obviously really, really critical that we have this legislation, some people may be wondering why we're here, citing this alarming concern that we have over this issue. So I'll give you an overview of why Earthroots and STORM are involved in this issue and why we feel the integrity of the soil is so important. Now, whatever you put into old sand and gravel pits is what the water will flow through. If you have contaminants in the soil, you're in fact polluting a new site and potentially the water. In some cases, we're seeing fill with debris and with a clay-like texture. Could in fact the type of soil be used in some cases be considered hard surfacing and limit the permeable nature of the moraine and affect recharge? Well, honestly, we don't know, but we obviously feel this needs to be thoroughly analyzed and obviously considered. Now, with over 250,000 people on the moraine depending on well water, it would be completely disastrous if these aquifers are contaminated. I don't need to remind you, but many farms in the Greenbelt and the Oak Ridges Moraine depend on these aquifers and streams to provide clean, safe water for crops and livestock. Imagine a dairy farm with a milk quota and the financial impact of their business if they were without safe water. While the brownfield legislation holds some laudable ideas, some very progressive concepts, I'm fairly certain that the intent was never to clean up old sites by creating new contaminated sites. Now, before the legislation passed, the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan passed, I think it's fair to say the environmental community's primary concern was that the law designed to protect the moraine would protect these tremendously important watersheds, and this policy would help curb urban sprawl. I never want to come out to a public event and criticize the legislation. We're so much better off to have this legislation than we are without it. But the reality is 10 years ago, no one, or I would think no one, could have predicted that hundreds of truckloads a day would descend on these rural communities, dumping fill from urban areas. I think it's safe to say that this wasn't on the radar. It's safe to say that regulating and monitoring commercial fill is falling between the legislative cracks, and that's one of the reasons Earthroots and STORM are so passionate about this issue. That's one of the reasons we're here. Now, in 2002, the Moraine Plan was passed, and in 2005, the Greenbelt Plan. The province recognized these areas are of great significance to people of Ontario. The Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan is all about protecting water. The Greenbelt Plan was intended to place a boundary on urban sprawl. As I said, we're lucky to have these policies, but we strongly feel that the Moraine Plan acts more as an effective land use plan than it does as a policy that effectively or sufficiently protects groundwater. That's what we're seeing through all these different examples, doing our own research and outreach over the past 10 years. With respect to fill, the main failure that I would have to sum up is that the main failure of the Moraine Plan with respect to fill is that the policy does not define site alteration as a land use. And this is something that we need to see addressed. Now, realizing that there's no provincial oversight, an Earthroots donor recently sponsored a study to analyze as many fill bylaws as we were able to obtain. So what we did was hire a researcher, and we started to gather data. And of course, we worked with Carmela and Ian from Lakeland Citizens for Clean Water. We started to gather data to get a sense of what was happening within close proximity to the GTA. I'm not sure, this is not the best visual, and if you guys have more questions about this, Debbie and I or Carmela would be happy to talk to you guys more about this. This is a hard thing to sum up quickly. But we looked at 68 municipal bylaws and conservation authority regulations in Southern Ontario, centered around Toronto. The numbers on the graph reflect the bylaws in that category. So I'll go through a few of them as what I think are the more important ones. Now, all the bylaws have erosion controls, so that's important. In terms of clean soil not being defined, I know we've talked about this before, or this has been briefly mentioned before. The bylaw says that the fill must be clean soil or free of contaminants, or there's a bylaw clause that the director may request an environmental impact study. Where the environmental impact study is defined in these bylaws, it is to identify sensitive areas, etc., but does not consider the soil quality. So essentially, clean soil is defined by vague mention to the Environmental Protection Act. So the ambiguity is problematic. There's a short clause that the soil is to, quote, not contain contaminants as defined in the Environmental Protection Act, or to, quote, not exceed maximum levels as defined in the Environmental Protection Act. And the issue of managing soil quality at large-scale fill sites. So there's an acknowledgement of a difference between small scale and large scale. Generally, but not always in all cases, there's requirement of tracking of loads, a QP or qualified person, and reference to tables 1 and 2. Of the ones that acknowledge a large-scale fill, some have a size-based scale for approvals by the director, then by council for larger ones, and the director or council can decide at their discretion to have a public meeting. Now, out of all the bylaws analyzed, only 4 even considered the fact there should be any public consultation. This, for me, is really telling, since Earthroots and STORM or a lot of our work is really about community outreach and just kind of getting people aware of their rights and how we can find out more information about a specific fill site in this case. This is actually, this is why we have so many groups coming out of the woodwork calling STORM and Earthroots. People are furious that they have hundreds of truckloads of fill coming through a day. And to Carmela's credit, I don't want to say Earthroots and STORM have really we're all about getting people together. We are good at facilitating this, but Carmela has done an amazing job. And what's happened as a result of Earthroots and STORM having these initial meetings and getting people together from different communities in the Greenbelt where there's fill sites, is now these groups, these small citizens groups are contacting each other and they're gaining more momentum. So it's really excellent. Okay, Moraine Can't Wait. I said I'd talk about this a little bit more. This was the campaign that Earthroots and STORM and Ontario Nature undertook to eventually rekindle our collaborative relationship. Why we called it Moraine Can't Wait, this meant that the integrity of the moraine is under threat and that we cannot afford to wait until 2015 when the plan was supposed to come up for official public review. Now, one of the first things we did was get together, collaboratively come up with what we saw as the 5 major threats to the moraine. Now, successes of the campaign included going door to door to the majority of the moraine's municipalities, canvassing people about the issues. I felt it was actually pretty sad because the majority of people that we canvassed, they lauded our efforts, but they felt that the provincial government had abandoned them. They enacted the legislation and they abandoned them. That was the reaction we got. We knocked on about 30,000 doors over the course of 2 months. I'll never forget driving with Debbie from farm to farm in Pontypool. Another key theme of our campaign was the resounding response we got from the majority of MPPs and councillors across the Moraine. A year and a half ago, some of these politicians hadn't heard of this issue. While each geographic area differed in terms of the environmental concern, many politicians that we spoke to agreed that the way the government's dealing with excess fill is simply not working. One important thing that we did as part of this campaign was organize an event at City Hall in Toronto last year. I know Glenn was there, so a lot of you were there. A lot of you here today were there. The event was centered around the moraine and specifically made the clear connection between development in Toronto and threats to groundwater on the moraine. This day was really great in that it precipitated a real dialogue between councillors in rural municipalities and councillors in Toronto, and I know that dialogue has continued. And after, as well, the enthusiasm that a few councillors showed after we met with them led to the City of Toronto staff report protecting Toronto's moraine source groundwater. Now, if you drive along the 404 or 401 and several two-lane regional roads, chances are you'll see caravans of trucks commuting along the highway. There's a chance that these trucks are carrying dirt or commercial fill, which is being driven to these old aggregate pits on the moraine. It's clear that smaller municipalities do not have the capacity to regulate or stop dumping in their communities. We're seeing more and more of this. There's no provincial regulate that specifically tracks, assesses, and enforces the movement and disposal of this dirt. And regulating these operations is left to respective municipalities, and we're seeing this as a real problem. Historically, fill has been moved around in rural Ontario. We're not saying that fill is a new issue, but what's new is the magnitude of soil being moved around. Neither STORM or Earthroots are opposed to fill. I want to make that entirely clear, to commercial fill. For smaller local fill operations, these regulations have changed the way they do business. It is not our assumption that everyone moving dirt is doing it improperly. I need to emphasize that point. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Do I have time? 1 minute. Okay. I'm going to run through the recommendations. Key recommendation that the province starts regulating fill instead of downloading this task to municipalities that in some cases do not have the capacity to regulate and monitor fill. It's imperative that we see a creation of an interministerial task force charged with creating legislation to monitor, track, and regulate fill in any and all movements from all source sites to intermediary and all destinations. And we also really think it's critical to consider soil banks for local roads and infrastructure projects. We've talked about this with other organizations and with Carmela, and consider implementing conditions on brownfield redevelopment permits. We do have more recommendations, but I thought I'd just keep it to one slide. Thank you.